Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming today. And so we are very fortunate to have Professor Kaivan Munshi from the University of Cambridge speaking to us. But prior to introducing him, I just wanted to say a few words about the person for whom this lecture is named. So this is Miss Indu Bhatt, and she was married to Dr. Kaivan Bhatt, who we're fortunate to have with us today. And Dr. Kaivan Bhatt has had a very long association with Yale. So he was a Yale research scholar, now retired, and Secretary Emeritus of the South Asian Studies Council, which is sponsoring this talk. And he started the South Asian Studies program here in 1991. Okay. And he dedicated this lecture series in loving memory of his wife, whose picture you see up here, okay? And to commemorate their joint work on South Asia. And Indu was revered by many students who were welcomed in her home for family meals, conversations, and discussions to compensate for her being away from home and providing services to students and scholars around the world. And let me now turn to our speaker for today. So Professor Kaivan Munshi he currently holds a Frank Ramsey Chair. So do I need to? This? Yes. Okay. So Professor Kaivan Munshi currently holds the Frank Ramsey Chair in Economics at the University of Cambridge, which is a very prestigious post previously held by Sir Partha Dasgupta for many, many years. And so we're very fortunate to have Kaivan here today before we have to start calling him sir, which probably will happen in a few years. And he's one of the world's foremost experts on how community networks shape economic activity. So his early work studied migrant networks from Mexico to the United States. And more recently, he studied how caste networks in India allow members to share risk, right, in situations where they're facing lots of risk but do not have access to formal insurance networks. And he's also studied how networks affect mobility, both in the context of historical United States, African American networks in the United States moving from the south to the north, as well as caste networks in India. And in these cases, what's interesting is that the networks can either play a positive or a negative role, either enhancing or preventing mobility from one place to another. So his body of work on the effects of networks on education, health, mobility are all of first-order importance for understanding growth and development. And he's published widely, but more importantly, the work is really important. It's influenced my own work and the work of many young scholars, because networks are an important element of how society is organized. Okay? And most recently, Kaivan won the Infosys Prize in the Social Sciences. That was in 2016. And that cements his place as one of the leading social scientists working on issues of relevance to South Asia. And this is why we thought about inviting him, that he's one of the foremost scholars on South Asia. And we're very lucky to have him speak to the South Asian Studies Council. Thank you, Kaivan, for coming.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor, and I'm very pleased to be here. This is actually the first paper in a much larger project that I've been engaged in for many years now, examining the role that communities play in different ways in shaping health outcomes in rural South India, in particular in Vellore district. You can see from the long list of co-authors, this is also an interdisciplinary list, that many people have been involved at different stages in this project. There's going to be research on communicable diseases, tuberculosis in particular. We have work on non-communicable diseases. We have work on nutrition. And this is work on sex selection. So this, in some sense, is a preview of more work that is going to come in the coming years. So let me just jump ahead and begin with the presentation. Sex selection through female feticide, infanticide, or neglect is a serious problem in India. Amartya Sen sort of brought this problem to public attention more than 25 years ago, when he famously claimed that more than 100 million women were missing in Asia. And since that time, India has made enormous economic progress, as you know. And we might expect that with this economic progress would come greater gender equality. But at least on this particular dimension, if anything, the problem has worsened. So here's just a slide which gives you a sense of the magnitude of the problem. So typically when the government of India, or in fact, many governments release statistics on child sex ratios, it's for children aged 0 to 6. And so that's what I'm doing over here. And the way that we actually report this as the number of boys per 100 girls. Okay, and so the first question to ask, of course, is what is the natural benchmark? What would you have without any kind of sex selection? So at birth, you will have about 105 boys to 100 girls. But that gap narrows very quickly. Now, you don't have a standard sort of benchmark for the 0 to 6 age group, but what you can use is the sex ratios that were in place in South India prior to the 1980s. So it is generally believed that till the early 1980s, there was no sex selection in South India. And I'll tell you more about this in a moment. So if you take, for example, South Indian statistics from the 1971 census or from the 1961 census, that would give us a sort of benchmark. And for the 0 to 6 age category, it works out to about 102.5 boys to 100 girls. Okay, so let's take that as the benchmark. If you take that as the benchmark, you can see right away that the worst states in the country are really very far from the natural level. In Haryana, for example, you now have 120 boys to 100 girls, age 0 to 6. Punjab and Delhi are not far behind. Now, if you look at the national level, the national average, it looks relatively, less severe. It's now about 109. But notice that South India, which, as I said, had almost no sex selection prior to 1980, now is almost caught up with the national average. Okay, so these are just some statistics, and the question to ask, of course, is where exactly is the problem? Where should we focus if we wanted to address this particular problem? Now, of course, if you look, it's natural to focus on these particular North Indian states because it's so sensational, and it doesn't certainly help that the capital of the country is right there at the very top. And as you might imagine, if you look at the media coverage, you look at the public discourse, a lot of the attention is devoted to these particular problematic states, all of which are in North India. But the point that I want to make today in the paper is that we should also focus on the all India level, because there is in fact within particular subpopulations substantial variation in sex ratios. And what we're going to be talking about today is variation within castes or jatis. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Indian social structure, Indian society is divided up into endogamous castes or jatis. There are about 4,000 castes in the country. And the basic rule is that you must marry within your caste. I've been working for now, as Mushfiq was saying, maybe 10 or 15 years on the role played by caste networks in shaping different types of economic activity. The reason why these networks are organized around the caste is because individuals marry within the caste. There are these very strong social ties which can be exploited to support and sustain different kinds of economic activities. When I began this research, there was actually very little information about the level of marriage within these castes. When I was doing these surveys in different parts of the country, I kept getting this number where 95% of people reported marrying within their caste. Since that time, there have been a couple of large-scale nationally representative surveys like the REDS, like the IHDS, and they also come up with the same number. And more importantly, there's now recent genetic evidence which tells us that Indians have been marrying in this way for 2,000 to 4,000 years. And so the point that I want to make is that if you look within these castes, which is what we're going to do in this paper, you're going to find enormous variation in sex ratios. In fact, the variation within castes in a single district in South India, which is actually quite unexceptional, is going to be as large as the variation across all states in the country. And that, to my mind, is the punchline of this research. This is something which has never been seen before, and the reason why we can show you this is because of the unique data that we have collected as part of this project. Now, the next sort of thing is, once you've documented this variation, the next question to ask, of course, is why do you see this variation in sex ratios within castes? And so for this, we're going to turn to the marriage institution in India, because as I said, one thing which is very particular to these castes is that people marry within them. There's essentially a marriage, a unique, a distinct, exclusive marriage market within each caste. And what we're going to do is to examine in great detail the way that this marriage market actually functions, as a way of understanding the root cause of the sex selection and how the sex selection varies within the caste. So we're not the first people to link the marriage institution to sex selection in India. In fact, this is very widely believed that the main cause of sex selection in India is in fact the marriage institution, and in particular the dowry. So here is, for example, an advertisement from an ultrasound clinic which says, "Is your baby boy or girl?" An ultrasound examination will tell you. Now, this, of course, was in the old days before this kind of sex selection was made illegal. But there was, in fact, an even more famous or infamous advertisement, which is the title of this slide, which was literally outside an ultrasound clinic, which said, "Pay 5,000 now, save 5 lakh later." And so that's a sense in which, in India, there is this notion that basically if you have a girl, you're at a disadvantage because you have to pay all of this money at the time of marriage. It is also widely believed that the wealthy are more likely to practice sex selection because they have to pay higher dowries. Now, you must understand that there is a limitation to this kind of argument because, of course, it is true that the wealthy pay higher dowries, but their daughters also marry into wealthier households where they will end up consuming at a higher level. So if the girl's parents internalize the benefit that these girls derive from marrying up in this way or marrying a wealthy household in this way, then in fact they may not be worse off having a girl relative to a less wealthy household. So one of the contributions that we would like to make here is to think more closely or more clearly about the link between wealth, marriage, and sex selection, as a way of understanding this variation in sex ratios within castes, which we're going to uncover. Okay, so in some sense, this is the sort of two-pronged objective here. The first is descriptive, it's empirical, to look within the caste using the new data that we have. And the second is more theoretical, to try to think about what it is about the marriage institution in India that gives rise to sex selection in the first place, and how the sex selection varies within the caste across the wealth distribution. And to make this connection, it's actually useful to think a little bit about the South Indian experience. So as I said, prior to the 1980s, there was no sex selection in South India. Of course, you always had marriage within the caste. This was true in North India, it was also true in South India. But the additional feature of marriage in South India was that basically people married very close relatives. So the most preferred match for a girl was either her mother's younger brother, or if he was unavailable, one of the mother's brother's sons. Now, marriage in India, and this is going to be very important as we go forward, is patrilocal. What this means is that when the girl marries, she leaves her natal home and moves into her husband's home. So in this case, with this particular pattern of marriage to close relatives, the girl was essentially moving into either her maternal grandfather's home or her maternal uncle's home. So this, of course, is a very close relationship. These are people that she knows very, very well. The families are very closely tied to each other. So one way to think about this is that this was almost like a cooperative arrangement. It was a reciprocal arrangement between two dynasties over many generations, where they would basically send girls back and forth. In one generation, the girl would go from one side to the other. The next generation, her daughter would go back in the opposite direction. And this would just keep on going from one generation to the next. There was no payment at the time of marriage, except for a small ritual payment, which was known as a stridhan. There was nothing else. The family was not disadvantaged if it had a daughter. And as a result, there was no sex selection. Okay, so that is the pattern that anthropologists have painted for us prior to the early 1980s. Now, this appears to have changed with economic development. So social scientists like Srinivas, like Caldwell, who really understand, I think, South Indian society very well, they link this change to economic development. And the basic idea that they put forward is that once you have economic development, families or dynasties that were very well matched on wealth over many, many generations suddenly were not. So there's a social anthropologist, Karin Kapadia, who has a wonderful ethnography of a Tamil village just around the time when all this change was actually occurring. And she describes how women, for example, who had married in a particular, in the traditional way, and then suddenly found that their husbands were doing extremely well, did not want their daughters to marry their younger brothers, who were in a totally different world economically now. And so in some sense, what really brought about the change was this push from the girl's side to actually stop this kind of marriage, and perhaps also from the boy's side, and to find a partner who was more sort of economically suitable. And so all of a sudden what ended up happening, you were still marrying within the caste. That didn't change. But now you did not marry in the traditional fashion to a particular close relative. Now what happened is you in some sense married on the market. And what you had were dowries coming in to essentially clear the marriage market. The dowry in some sense was a price to clear the marriage market. And people have noticed this. In fact, there is an economist at the World Bank, Vijendra Rao, who's done some very interesting work on dowry in the 1990s. And what he finds is that, in fact, dowries in South India are now as high as they are in South India. In North India. So things have really started to change. Now, around the same time, starting from the 1980s, you also started to see sex selection kicking in South India. And it's tempting from the intertemporal correlation to link the dowry to the sex selection. But the point that we want to make is that what really drove the sex selection was not the dowry per se. It was specific features of the marriage market which also emerged at just about the same time. And that is what's going to give rise, at least in our theory, to the sex selection. Okay, so this is sort of the background. And when we try to actually understand better the link between marriage and sex selection, we will draw on particular features of the marriage institution in India. And this is sort of, these are the sort of key features that we will use in our analysis, both for the theory as well as for the empirics. The first one, which I mentioned earlier, is that marriages in India are endogamous within the caste or the jati. The second feature is that marriages are arranged, with wealth being the major consideration. And again, Vijendra Rao has some work where he looks at the determinants of the matching between families or between partners. And of course, individual characteristics do matter, like education or the looks of the partners. But the prime driving force is the wealth of the families. That's what they are matching on. And in our model, we're going to focus exclusively on this wealth matching between households. The third feature of marriage, which is relevant for us, is, of course, this notion of a dowry. The fact that at the time of marriage, there is a payment from the girl's side to the boy's side. The fourth feature of marriage is that it is patrilocal, that the girl moves into her husband's home at the time of marriage. And the fifth feature is the social norm that all girls must marry. There is a huge social stigma in India if a girl remains single. And these last two features of the marriage institution are going to be the proximate determinants of sex selection in our model, as you will see. All of these other features will play a role, but it's the last two which are going to basically drive the sex selection. Okay? Now, before I get to the model, and that's where I'm going to probably tax you all a little bit when I get to that section, let me just give you a little background on the study and some sort of descriptive sort of statistics which show you that the marriage institution in our study area looks pretty much like what I just listed for you. So as I said, what this is sort of part of a larger project which we call the South India Community Health Study. It covers a rural population in the state of Tamil Nadu in Vellore district. And this is, for those of you who are not familiar with the geography of India, Tamil Nadu is basically the southernmost state in India, and Vellore district is actually literally the northern edge of Tamil Nadu. It's right up against Andhra Pradesh. It's sort of halfway between Bangalore and Chennai. Okay, and our study area basically covers about half of rural Vellore district. It's not contiguous, but the reason for this is because it's also part of a larger project on tuberculosis, and so there were reasons why we picked this particular area. But it turns out to be actually quite fortuitous, as you will see, because the study area is very representative of both rural Tamil Nadu as well as rural South India, which we define by the states of Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Andhra Pradesh, in terms of socioeconomic characteristics and demographic characteristics. So if you look at the age distribution, if you look at marriage patterns, if you look at literacy, if you look at labor force participation, you will see that our study, rural Tamil Nadu and rural South India, line up almost perfectly. Okay? And so what I'm going to argue is that the area that we're working in is not special at all. It's just a generic place. There's nothing special at all about it. Now, in the analysis today, we're going to make use of two components of the 6. The first is a census of all the 300,000 households in the study area that we conducted. So as I said, this is the population of 1.1 million. So this is a large enterprise. We basically collected, not detailed information, but certain, important basic information about every individual in each of these households. We followed this up with a detailed survey of 5,000 households, where we collected lots of information about transfers between households, investments that parents make in the children, including the time they spend on them, lots of information about health and education, as well as on marriage. And so we're going to use both of these data sources in the analysis today. So here is data from the household survey. And I just want to show you that some of the key features of marriage institution show up very clearly in our study area. So as I told you earlier, 95% of Indians appear to marry within their caste. And that's exactly what you see over here. So basically, the little sliver that you see, this little gray sliver that you see, that's the fraction of individuals, both in the parental generation as well as in among the children who married outside of their caste. And it's basically less than 5%. Among those who marry within their caste, in the parental generation, about 50% married a close relative. This has now declined to about 35%. And if you look at whether the marriages are arranged or not, somewhere between 80 and 90% of the marriages are arranged. So that hasn't changed at all over the generations. What about the dowry? And as I said, now dowries in South India are just as high as they are in North India. In our data, what you find is that the dowry is somewhere between 3 to 4 times the household's annual income. So to put this in perspective, if you wanted to buy a house in the US or in the UK, you could get about 2.5 times your annual income from the bank. These households in rural India who have access to no formal credit at all or any kind of formal financial institution are able to somehow come up with 3 to 4 times their annual income. And in past work that I've done with Mark Rosenzweig, what we find is that the source of the funds are basically the same as the caste networks themselves, which support these people at the time of marriage. But regardless of what it is, what's clear is that this is a huge amount of money. The other thing which is interesting is if you can see here, the amount that the boys say they received is less than the amount that the girls say they gave. And this is not an artifact of the data. This is actually exactly what was predicted by our model. And the reason for that is because when there is sex selection, there's a shortage of girls. And so very naturally, you get what is known as hypergamy, where girls end up on average marrying with wealthier boys. And as a result of that, they end up paying a higher dowry than boys at the same level are going to receive. And you can see the hypergamy in our data as well. So we have one question where we ask the parent about the child's spouse's family. So the question is when the child married, was the spouse's family of the same wealth, higher wealth, or lower wealth? And what you find is that for the boys, 9% say that they married into a wealthier family, whereas for the girls, it is 18%. And for the boys, 29% say they married into a less wealthy family, whereas for the girls, it is 17%. Now, this is just a response to one question, but we have new data now on the marital villages of all of the marriage partners. And so we're going to be using that to look more carefully at this kind of hypergamy and to look at how this varies across the wealth distribution. But that's not going to be ready for a little while. We're still in the process. We have some preliminary results which are very promising. But for now, this is what we have. Now, with this background, what I want to do is to now take you into a slightly unfamiliar territory for those of you who are not economists. I want to actually take you through, in a very verbal way, an economic model. Okay? And this is not the easiest thing, I realize, and this is not going to be the most exciting part of the talk. This is not a very exciting talk anyway, because I actually want you all to think more about the fundamentals and less about all the, sensational stuff. But I think for us to understand why it is the case that you have sex selection and what is the link between the marriage institution and sex selection, we really have to think more seriously about the fundamentals, about the economics. So why don't you bear with me? It's going to take a little while. And for those, and you might have to, for those of you who are not economists, use your imaginations a little bit, because actually thinking in this way is not easy, I realize. The key feature of an economic model is that it's not going to try to explain every feature of the world that we live in. A good economic model is essentially a caricature of the world. It tries to pick out those features of the world that are most relevant for the problem that we're trying to study. So in this particular model, it's going to be very stripped down, as you will see. What we will try to do is to capture those aspects of the marriage institution that turn out to be relevant for sex selection. Okay, so to begin with, each family is going to be very strange over here. It's going to consist of a single parent. So we don't give a gender to the parent. It could be a man or a woman or whatever it is, and a single child. Now, what matters, of course, is the gender of the child. So the child is going to be either a boy or a girl. Okay, we're going to assume that parents are altruistic. These are all very extreme assumptions. We're doing it in a way to sort of set it up so that we're going to shut down many other explanations for what we're going to find. So parents are completely altruistic. They care as much about their children's consumption as for their own consumption. And in addition, they don't care about the child's gender. So there's no intrinsic preference for boys in this model. The preference for boys is going to come out naturally or endogenously from the structure of the marriage institution. Okay? And the other feature, sorry.
You mean one parent or one pair of parents? You mean one parent?
There's going to be one parent per child. So we're not thinking about a father and a mother here. It's just going to be a parent. So I want you to, as I said, use your imagination. This is not a fairy tale, but it's a way of sort of stripping down and trying to, and there's just one child. There's not multiple children again. It's just one child. Okay? Now, marriage is going to be patrilocal. What it means is, as I said, that the girl leaves her parental home at the time of marriage and moves into her husband's home. And so the one way to think about the dowry is that it's actually a price in the marriage market. The other way to think about the dowry is that it's actually a pre-mortem bequest. And that's how people have actually thought about it in the past. So in India, for example, when the father dies, his son is going to inherit the property, etc. Things have changed now, I understand. The property laws have changed. But at least traditionally, when the father died, the sons would inherit the property. So how would he then give a bequest to his daughter? The way he gave a bequest to his daughter, one way to think about this, was through the dowry. So dowry was in some sense her inheritance. But the important feature of the dowry is that it did not go directly to her. It went to her husband's parent in our model, and then through him, as you will see, some of it ultimately came down to her. But it didn't go directly to her, and as a result, there's going to be a lot of seepage along the way. Some of that is going to get siphoned off by her in-laws. And that is going to be one distortion that's going to give rise to sex selection in our model, as you will see. Okay? So here is a way of thinking about the structure of this particular sort of, marriage institution. So I've actually drawn two parents over here, but I've kind of put them on top of each other. So think of it as one person, okay? Just to make it, but I didn't give them a gender, so I kind of made a man and a woman somehow, So that's the parent. There's a girl's parent in yellow, and then there's the boy's parent in blue. Okay? And I've set it up so that to begin with, both parents have wealth of 100 units each. The girl's parent has to decide how much dowry to give. And I'm just making up these numbers, okay? So there's nothing, underlying this or anything. I just made them up. So I'm going to say that this girl's parent is going to give a dowry of 45 to the boy's parent. So now the boy's parent has a total wealth of 145, right? And what does he do? He gives 80 as a transfer to his son, and he keeps, therefore, 65 for himself for his own consumption. Now this 80 is going to be divided up between the boy and his wife. So this is the second sort of seepage that creeps in. And the basic idea here is because the wife lives with her husband, there's no way that she can be excluded entirely. The father would like to give, or the parent would like to give everything to the son. But because the girl and the son live together, she's going to get some share of it, and the boy's going to get some share of it. And we're going to assume that she's going to get less than half. So in this case, she gets 35, and the boy gets 45. And now you can start to see how this particular structure, which is basically built around the structure of the marriage institution in India, gives rise to different types of distortions. If the girl's parent could give the money directly to the daughter, we've assumed here that this person is altruistic. That person would just share the wealth equally, keep 50 for herself and give 50 to the daughter. But because she knows that she's going to give this dowry, which is going to get eaten up by the boy's parent and by the boy as well along the way, ends up giving less than 50. So now the girl's parent is consuming 55 and has given 45 in dowry. But even the 45 doesn't get to the girl. Only 35 comes to the girl. And from the boy's parents' perspective, there's also a seepage. Because what the boy's parent would like to do is to give half of the consumption to the boy and keep half for himself. But he can't do that. When he gives the transfer, the girl ends up taking 35, leaving only 45 for the boy. So you can see here that there are these particular sort of seepages in the model, and this is what's going to give rise to the sex selection. So now that we have this set up, what I'm going to do is to take you through 3 steps. At this point, what I had was 2 households coming together with wealth of 100 each. The first step is to actually model the matching. How do households in this marriage market on the boy side and the girl side match with each other? The next step is to talk about the sex selection and to show that there is sex selection at every wealth level. And the last step is to actually show how the sex selection varies across the wealth distribution. That brings us back to where we started, which is to try to explain how the sex ratios vary within these castes. Okay, so let's start off with the first thing, which is the matching. So my claim is that in this particular setup, you're going to have what is called positive assortative matching, where wealthy parents of girls match with wealthy parents of boys. And now, of course, the dowry is going to play 2 functions. It's going to be a bequest, as we discussed earlier. It's also going to be a price to clear the marriage market. And so the first question to ask is, why does it end up this way? Why do the wealthy girls' parents end up paying a high dowry to get them married to wealthy boys? And the reason, of course, is because of the bequest motive. They want their girls to consume at a higher level because they themselves are starting off at a higher level of wealth. So they're willing to pay a higher dowry so that the girls will marry with a wealthy family, and the wealthy parent on the other side is going to give a larger transfer, some of which is going to come down to the girl herself. Now, ultimately, all girls' parents want to match with the wealthiest boys. And so the dowry has to be increasing steeply enough to separate out these different families on the girls' side, so that at the end of the day, it's the wealthiest parents of the girls who match with the wealthiest parents of the boys, and so forth as you move down the wealth distribution. So what this shows you is how you're going to end up with positive dowries because of the bequest, and also steeply increasing dowries, not because the boys are demanding more money, it's because the wealthy girls' parents are trying to separate themselves from the less wealthy girls' parents. Okay? Now, once you have this matching structure, the next step, as I said, is to show that there is, in fact, sex selection at every wealth level. Now, this requires a little bit of concentration. So let me try to give you the intuition, and let me see whether I can get this across to you all, for those of you who don't have an economics background. Okay? So,
I understand the girl's family wants to get the highest man, but the boy's family also realizes that it can get more because they're rich. And so does it actually, I know it's a simple model, but does it actually not happen that the boy's family also starts demanding more because they can?
But they can't, there's a marriage market, right? So basically they can't, there's a market, you'll see this as we go through the model. There's think about the dowry as a market clearing price. So at the end, this price is going to be determined in equilibrium just like you would with any price in any market. So it's not that they would like to get as much as they can, and you will see that. But they cannot demand, any amount that they want, because at the end of the day, there'll always be some other boy who might be a little less wealthy who would go with a slightly lower dowry. So the dowry is going to basically adjust in equilibrium so that the market essentially clears itself. Okay, so yeah, so are we taking questions through the thing, or it's totally up to you? I'm happy to go either way.
Maybe we can do just clarification questions.
Yeah, could we do that? Because and that might be easier if that's okay.
Okay, so
Yeah.
on the and if these are not clarification, then don't answer the
No.
question. So the girl's family could, in a different institution, could give money to the girl directly. You're just kind of ruling that out.
That would solve the whole problem, as you can see.
Yeah.
And I'll talk about that later on. Yeah, exactly. So what we're trying to do is to sort of look at the structure of this marriage institution and say, what is it precisely about this marriage institution that's giving us this problem? And you can see here it's basically a lack of commitment, that they cannot give it directly. And the boy's parent, of course, is, once he gets the money, he's going to do exactly what he wants to do. And that's the problem, right? Yeah, you have another question?
And the second
Yeah.
one is that, in the numbers you made up, maybe the numbers don't matter, but, the girl's, the boy's family is having to feed that girl for
Yes.
the rest of her life or
Yeah.
something, right? So,
Mhm.
so another motivation here might be that, okay, I'm going to be feeding her, therefore I need to be paid in advance.
But that's precisely the one way to think about the bequest, is that she's basically getting this inheritance. And the reason why you need the dowry is because the boy's parent is not going to accept. So in our model, there will always be positive dowries. And I'll come to this in a second. And the reason, because without that, why would he ever, this is going to come up right this moment. Because in some sense, you're right. She's going to live off them for the rest of her, time, right? And so what she's bringing in some sense, is the dowry as a sort of,
But just to add on to that,
Yeah.
she's an additional labor force. So it's
Yeah.
not a question of she's living off them exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where I said we want this to be sort of an abstract thing. So we're abstracting away from all these other things. There's no education in this model. There are no children in the model. So all of that is sort of, there's no production in this model. So in some sense, you need to sort of, think about it as it is, which is just a way of just getting a sense of, the intuition of what is going on over here. Those are all important considerations. Don't get me wrong.
Grandchildren play no role.
That's what I'm saying, and this is the thing, right? So and you would think that this is important. Grandchildren, one reason why the boy's parent might want to actually give something to her is because of the grandchildren. But we're shutting down all of these things here. It's just a single generation. There's a fixed amount of wealth. And so this is where now we can talk about the sex selection. So what is special about this model is that there's no production here. You have a wealth endowment. And so you think now about, basically a boy's family with wealth X and a girl's family with wealth Y, and they've come together in the marriage market, let us say, okay? We're not thinking, it could be anything. X and Y could be any number. We don't really care about it. So what's the total wealth that they have? It's X plus Y. And the question is, in this model, is how is this X plus Y going to be distributed between the boy's side and the girl's side? And what turns out to matter a lot for this is the outside option, what they would get outside of marriage. And so the assumption that we're going to make is that from the boy's side, the outside option, the lower bound on staying in the marriage, is basically what the boy and his parent would get if he was single. In which case, they would have X. And then being altruistic, the boy's parent would give X over 2, half of that to the son, and keep the other half for himself. Now what about the girl's side? Now remember here there is a social norm that all girls must marry. So from the girl's side, there's no such lower bound. And that is going to turn out to basically create an imbalance within the marriage. The boys have an outside option, but the girls don't have an outside option. So they're going to end up, as you will see in a moment, getting less than their share of this total pie. And to understand that, let's go a little bit now into some very basic economics. So the basic assumption in economics when it comes to consumer behavior is that the more you consume, the greater utility you get. Right? Individuals are insatiable. That's one assumption. But the second assumption is that for every extra unit that you consume, the extra utility that you get keeps going down. And that is what is called diminishing marginal utility. So now you think about a boy's parent with wealth X. And he is fully altruistic. He wants to maximize the utility of his own consumption and his son's consumption. So what is he going to do? He will split it equally between the two of them so that the marginal utility for both the boy and the father is exactly the same. And the point here is that in this particular setup of ours, the most efficient way to use a fixed amount of resources between a parent and the child is to divide it up equally. If you want to get to that same level of utility and you don't divide up the resources equally, you will need more resources than that. So now when the boy and the father go into the marriage, they are going to end up consuming at a different level. Why is that? And that goes back to my simple example, if you remember. The reason is because the boy's father, even though he's fully altruistic, he's going to end up consuming more than his son. And the reason is because he knows that whatever transfer he gives, some of that is going to get siphoned off by the girl. And as a result, he will end up consuming more than his son. Now, because the two of them are consuming at a different level in the marriage institution, they will need more than X to get to the same level of utility that they would get, which is their outside option, if the boy was single. But given that the total pie is X plus Y, if they end up consuming more than X, then the girl's side is going to end up consuming less than Y. So now you can think about this. If you're a girl's parent and you have wealth Y, if your girl gets married, and she has to get married because once she's a girl, you and the girl together will get less than Y for your own consumption. But if you were able to select and switch from a girl to a boy, you would get more than Y for the same reason that I just told you. So you are basically better off having a boy than having a girl. Now, of course, there's going to be a cost to sex selection. Not everybody is going to just therefore switch over and have a boy as a result. But you can imagine there's going to be a distribution of costs. And as long as that distribution of costs is such that there are some families with a very, very, very low cost of sex selection, then you will always have some amount of sex selection at every wealth level. So that is the second result. So the first result that I showed you was that you have positive assortative matching on wealth. The second result now is that you have sex selection at every wealth level. The last step in this whole process is to look at how sex selection varies across the wealth distribution. So what I've done now is to give you a very simple example again, where I've fixed the sex ratio. So we know that there is sex selection. What I've said is now that every wealth level, you're going to have 2 boys to 1 girl. Okay? And you have positive assortative matching, which means that the wealthiest boys match with the wealthiest girls, and we keep going down the distribution, right? So one of the wealthiest boys is going to match with the wealthiest girl. The second boy, of course, can't do that. He's going to go down 1 level. Now when you go down to the second level, one of the boys is going to match down 1 level. The other boy is going to match 2 levels down. When you go to the third level, one boy matches 2 levels down, the other boy matches 3 levels down. So what you're seeing here is that as you move down the wealth distribution, the wealth gap is mechanically getting bigger and bigger. So you know that this cannot be an equilibrium, because as you move down, girls' parents are less disadvantaged by having a girl because they're matching up with wealthier and wealthier boys. And as a result, this sex ratio must adjust so that as you move down the wealth distribution, in fact, it will start to become slightly more favorable towards the girls. And so the basic prediction here is that as you move down the wealth distribution, you will see less sex selection. Now this, of course, is a very simple model where I've completely ignored the dowry, the fact that the sex selection is sort of endogenously determined with the wealth distribution, etc. So the actual model in the paper is quite complicated. But this gives you the basic intuition. To solve it out analytically is very difficult. What we can show, however, is that at 2 points in the wealth distribution, at the very top of the wealth distribution, where the wealthiest girls and the wealthiest boys with equal wealth match with each other, you can show that sex selection is increasing with wealth. At the lowest wealth level at which boys marry, that's the wealth level at which these boys basically end up getting just their outside option, nothing more than that. We can also show over there that sex selection is increasing with wealth. But to show this across the entire wealth distribution, we had to turn to numerical solutions. And I'm going to show you that in a second. But the other point that I want to emphasize is that in this kind of model, it's a very simple model, but notice here that you will always have positive dowries. Because if you don't, and this is the point that came up earlier, because if the girl's parent does not give a positive dowry to the boy's parent, then there's no way that the boy's parent will ever be compensated sufficiently, because they need more than X, basically. And so at every wealth level, even the last boy to match, he's basically going to get a dowry. Okay? So this is the basic intuition. And what you can do, as I said, is to solve the model numerically. What we have in the numerical model is the same structure as what I just showed you. It's the same basic idea, but now we just give particular numbers and we kind of solve it out. And you have 100 wealth classes for the boys' side and 100 wealth classes for the girls' side. So the first thing to notice in this picture is that if you go to the top of the wealth distribution, which is the 100th wealth class for the females and the 100th wealth class for the males, the red line coincides with the blue line. What is the blue line? The blue line is a 45-degree line. This is a line at which the boys' wealth and the girls' wealth is exactly equal. So what this is saying is that when you get to the very top, girls with wealth 100 and boys with wealth 100 match with each other. As you move down, notice that the red line starts to shift away from the blue line. What does that mean? That means that girls are matching with wealthier boys. And this gap keeps widening as you move down. So that is the hypergamy. This idea that as you move further down the wealth distribution, the gap between girls and boys keeps widening. What are the consequences of this for the sex selection? And this is the intuition that I gave you with that simple example. But now, of course, we've got the dowries in there and everything is done endogenously and simultaneously, but you still get the same intuition. What you find is on the y-axis over here, what you have is a probability that the child is a girl. And on the x-axis, you have the wealth class. And so as you move to higher and higher wealth classes, the probability that the child is a girl keeps decreasing. What happens to your dowry? Your dowry is actually increasing. So if I looked at this in the data, you would say, look, the dowries are going up and there are less girls. There is this correlation between the two. But what you can see from the structure of our model is that what is driving the sex selection is not the dowry. It's in fact the social norm that all girls must marry. And that is tilting the balance of power in favor of the boys versus the girls. There's another force in our model which also drives sex selection. And that has to do with the seepage, which is basically when the girl's parents gives the dowry to the boy's parent. If you remember, the girl only gets some fraction of that. She gets some fraction of the transfer that the boy's parent gives to his son. Let's call that alpha. And what we assumed was that that was less than 1/2. Basically, as that seepage gets larger and larger, having a girl becomes less and less attractive for the parent. And as a result, you start to see more and more sex selection. So that's the second way in which you can have sex selection in our model. So to sort of summarize all of this has been quite a lot of work. But basically what I want you to take away from this is that there is a way of understanding why there will be variation in sex selection within a narrow caste, within a local area. What you should expect to see is that within that caste, in a local area, relatively wealthy households will end up having more sex selection than less wealthy households within caste. Okay, that's the key prediction. Now it turns out that there are other models that could do this without getting into all of this complication. The reason why we had to go through all this complication is because we're trying to explain this with the marriage institution as the starting point. Suppose instead you just had boy-son preference. Suppose, for example, parents just preferred boys to girls. It's a much simpler model, and you would get the same prediction that as you move down the wealth distribution, there's going to be less and less sex selection. But our model, I think, is preferred for two reasons. The first reason is that with this alternative model, where parents just simply, for whatever reason, prefer to have sons versus daughters, what ends up happening, of course, is that once the sex selection has taken place, you will still have a marriage market. You will still have a marriage price. But now, because there is a shortage of girls relative to boys, the money will go in the opposite direction. There's going to be a bride price. And you think about, for example, a country like China, where, by all accounts, there's no problem with the marriage market. The reason why you have sex selection in China is because parents want at least one son. That's a totally different motivation to ours. In China, you have sex selection. You have very high levels of sex selection, but you actually have extremely high bride prices. So when the time comes to decide whether you want to have a boy or a girl, you do prefer to have a boy. But then once the dust has settled in some sense, and there's a shortage of girls, then the thing tilts over. And now, basically, you're going to have these extremely high prices for girls. They can demand very high premium. Now, in India, it's exactly the opposite, which is the strange thing. In India, you have a shortage of girls, and at the same time, you have extremely high dowries. And that tells you that there must be something going on in the marriage market itself, which is driving both the dowries as well as the sex selection. The second distinguishing feature of our model is that if you think about son preference, the usual story is that parents want to have at least one son. Now, suppose you had 5 kids, for example. So when you have the first kid, if it's a girl, you're like, okay, fine. You have the second kid, it's a girl, you're like, okay, it's fine. By the time you get to the third kid, you start to worry. Now I already had 2 girls, maybe I should do some kind of adjustment. But maybe you won't do too much. When you get to the 4th kid, you're going to really start to worry, and you're going to start to do more and more adjustment. More parents will start to do adjustment. By the time you get to that 5th kid, you're really going to just see boys and nothing else. And so one implication of son preference is that as you move to higher and higher birth orders, you're more and more likely to see boys being born. But the other implication is that for the first birth, where you don't really have this pressure, you really shouldn't be seeing any sex selection. Even if you have just 2 kids, you don't really need to sex select on that first kid. You can do all of the damage or the mischief on the second kid. In our model, you should be seeing sex selection everywhere, even for the first births. And if you look at data in India, so this is basically data from the DHS and from the IHDS. And these are nationally representative surveys, so you don't have that many observations. So what we've done is to look at all the kids aged 0 to 6 in rural South India. And then, of course, in our census, we have lots of data. You can see here we have 80,000 kids. But the main point is that if you look at the sex ratio for the first births, it's about 106 boys to 100 girls. And if you look at the overall sex ratios, it's about 109, which is basically the South India average. So you can already see that there's an elevated sex ratio even for the first births. Okay? Yeah.
That's the biological ratio, 105.
No. So that's the biological. I think you came in later. So 105 at birth.
Yeah.
We're looking at kids age 0 to 6. So at that point, of course, there's going to be catch up, and so the benchmark that we're using is 102.5. So you're elevated even for the first births. Okay. So now that we have all of this background, let me just show you some results which sort of get to the other sort of key sort of aspect of this research. As I said, one thing was to document that there is this variation in sex ratios within these castes, even in a local area. And the second thing was to explain why you see those sex ratios. So I've just taken you through all of this theory. So now let me just sort of show you the data, okay? So the first thing is, as I just showed you, sex ratios in the study area are just around the South Indian average, okay? They're quite standard. None of the castes in Tamil Nadu that are traditionally associated with severe sex selection, like the Gounders in Salem district, for example, none of those castes are actually present in this particular study area of ours. And so what I would like to claim is that even though this is data from just one district, this in some sense is representative. The marriage institution is organized the same way in all castes in the country. We have a particular district which looks very sort of standard, run-of-the-mill. So if you see this in this particular place, you will very likely see this among all the other castes or many other castes in the country as well. And that is the point that I want to try to make. Okay? So let me just get now to the actual results. I'm going to skip over all of this in the interest of time. We have a lot of control. We look at the thing. It's a very robust relationship. This is the key finding. This is the relationship between the probability that a child, this is now in our census data, the probability that a child aged 0 to 6 is a girl, the relation between that and the rank of the household in its caste wealth distribution. So this is based on per capita wealth, where we adjust for the size of the household. And what we do is we basically find the rank of the caste in the wealth distribution. And the basic finding is that if you go to the very bottom of the wealth distribution, you actually have parity, or slightly above. There's a slight excess of girls, which really shouldn't come from our model, but you see this in the data. Okay, but it's certainly parity. You're definitely, you're not badly off at all. But by the time you come down over here, and I'm going to tell you what the magnitudes are. You basically see that there's a very sharp decline in the probability that the child is a girl. Now, this is pooling all the castes. There are about 50 castes in the study area. But it turns out that 12 castes make up 82% of the population. So what you can do, because of the huge amount of data that we have, is to look caste by caste. So what we're doing now is to take the 12 largest castes and plot the relationship between the probability that the child is a girl and the position, the household's position in the wealth distribution, caste by caste. And you basically see out of the 12 castes, it looks exactly right for 9 of them. There are 3 which don't work. There's the one over here. I'm not going to get into the names, but it's basically the second from right in the second row and these 2 over here. The rest all look pretty good. But what I want to tell you is that when you get down over here, you have less than 2,000 kids. And this is the point when you're looking at sex ratios, you really need a lot of data to get stable results. And what I'm going to show you in a second is that when you switch, instead of looking at the 0 to 6-year-olds, you look at the 7 to 13-year-olds. This is just a previous group. They should have the same patterns. And in fact, indeed they do. And now if you look at those problem castes, it's perfect. And of course, for the larger castes, you keep getting the same patterns. Now, what is also very striking is if you look at the 2 largest castes, you have the Vanyas, who are a landowning caste. They're an upper caste. And you have the Adi Dravidars, who are the lowest of the low castes. The traditional name, which actually should not be used at all anymore, is Paraya. So the English word Paraya comes from this caste name. These are 2 castes which are at the polar opposite ends of the social spectrum. But if you look in our data, what you find is exactly the same patterns for both of these castes. Yes?
So there is an increasing trend up to 0.6 for many of these.
Yeah. So we can't really explain this level of detail. So it is coming up, but we cannot statistically, we probably won't be able to reject that in fact they are kind of the same. So this is data. So we can't exactly get the pattern that the theory would predict. Of course, it's going to turn up a bit over here. Sometimes it's going to go bunch up and down a bit over here, and that's just statistics. That's kind of where we are with that. Okay. So this is sort of, as I said, the key result. And to give you a sense of the magnitude of these effects, what you can look at is how much of the variation in sex ratios in this entire study area can be explained within castes and between castes. And the usual story would be that there are certain castes which are really bad, and they're the ones who are doing all the sex selection. But what you find in our study area, if you take the 30 largest castes, is that 70% of the variation is within caste. And if you take the 12 largest castes, it's as much as 87%. So most of the variation is in fact happening within caste. And the point that I want to emphasize is that if you did not have our data, there would be no way for you to ever even see this. This is the first time that anyone's ever been able to look at this level of detail within these castes. And what you find is something extremely striking. Now, there's another way to look at the magnitude of the variation, which is to look at the sex ratios across the wealth distribution. If you divide up the wealth distribution to 8 wealth classes, the lowest wealth class, as I said, you actually have parity, a little bit, even better than parity. There's a slight excess of girls. There's 97 boys to, 100 girls or whatever, right? But at the worst place, it is 117. And think back to the first slide that I showed you with Delhi and Haryana and Punjab. They were right over there. It was like 118, 120. Delhi was 115. So basically, the variation in sex ratios within these castes in one district, which has a relatively inconspicuous sex ratio overall of 108, is as much as a variation across states in the country. And so this is something that we really need to think about as we move forward, because most of the attention has been on particular problematic states or castes like the Jats or the Gaundars, for example, in Salem, where people already know that these are the problem places. But if our results are more general, then what this tells us is, in fact, this problem is way more pervasive than people have realized. This could be through all the 4,000 castes. If you look within them, you might find these patterns. And you would never see this if you just had district level data. And so we really need to now ask ourselves, what could you do to deal with the problem? Now, what's nice about our analysis, I took you through all this hard work of working through the model. Once the model is set up, we've already done the numerical, we solved the model numerically, we can estimate the structural parameters of this model, and we can do counterfactual experiments. And we can ask ourselves, suppose there was a policy change, what would happen to the sex selection? And what our model would do is it would allow the dowries to shift, it would allow the wealth distributions to shift, everything would happen endogenously because our model is now all set up to match the data.
So we skipped over all your controls.
Yeah.
One simple one that would be useful to hear about is, wealthier people might be able to afford more sex.
So guess what? If you put in the household wealth directly, which is the absolute wealth, you get a positive and significant effect. There are more
in terms of
girls. It goes in the opposite. If anything, putting those things in makes it stronger. Yeah. No, I'm doing everything rural because our data is rural. Yeah. So I don't see anything about the urban, by the way. Yeah.
So you said there was no sex selection in 1980, and then over time it increased. So what was changing in your model over time?
No, so our model is not dynamic. So what we're trying to do is this is a very good question. So we're not trying to explain the change from pre-1980 to post-1980. Our model basically kicks in the post-1980 period when the marriage market is already in place. We're not trying to explain the change at all. We're looking at the world which currently exists, where the sex selection, where the marriage market has already emerged. Our analysis is cross-sectional. It's not dynamic. That was just motivational, what I was telling you earlier. Our analysis is not trying to explain.
But you can still make some comparative.
I can't because I don't have data over time. We have a one-time census. So I can't do what you would. That would be very nice. If I had data over time from, let's say, 1975 to now, I could actually look over time and see these changes. But I can't do that.
Well, I guess one of the key mechanisms in your model was this seepage, imperfect seepage, and altruistic preference, right? Then naturally there must be some change in seepage rate over time to kind of expect.
Absolutely. So can I get to that later? I want to talk about that actually, the seepage, the alpha at the very end. I will talk about that. It's not part of our analysis. It's going to be something that I'm going to talk about as sort of future research, because we can't, in our model, there's a fixed alpha at a particular point in time. Not alpha, this fixed seepage rate. Do you have a question? No? Okay. So let me just conclude by doing one final thing, which is to say, now that we have this model set up, can we actually do some kind of counterfactual policy experiments? And one thing to do here is to actually think about current policies that are in place. Everyone knows that this is a problem. And so there are many state governments, as well as the central government, that have schemes in place to try to deal explicitly with sex selection. And one very popular scheme is a conditional cash transfer program, where basically what they do is parents of girls, they receive a transfer at different points in the girl's life. So when the girl's birth is registered and they do the regular, the required immunizations, they get some transfer. When the girl completes primary school, they get some transfer. When she completes higher secondary school, they get some transfer. And in addition, there is an insurance cover which matures when she turns 18 or 20, at which point the money goes into a bank account in her name. Now, of course, it's not clear, because the bank account is her name, who actually gets it. Is it her parents? Is it her? Is it the in-laws? We don't know that. But in our policy experiments, we're going to allow for the possibility that somehow the money could go directly to her. And we're going to see what happens in our model to sex selection as a result of that. The other feature of these schemes, which is actually important, is that many of the schemes actually restrict the transfers to families below a particular wealth level. And I think these are well-intentioned schemes. The general thing with conditional cash transfers is you want to give it to poor households. But in this particular case, given what I've just shown you, you're actually giving it to the households which are not at most risk. So what's going to happen as a result of that? So this is basically what you find, okay? So the blue line is the benchmark. This is what is predicted by our model, okay? The solid red line is this conditional cash transfer, which is given only to the poor families. So in our model, in this sort of simple model that we have over here, there are 8 wealth classes. And what we specify is that it's only the bottom 2 wealth classes that get the transfer.
Which is bottom?
Sorry? There was a question. This is the bottom. Oh, sorry, let me explain to you. Okay. So this is now, I've gone back to the sex ratio now. So this is now.
Side of the x-axis is bottom.
This. Yeah.
Which is more money, which is less money.
This is more money, this is less money. Yeah. And also just to clarify, I mean, just that you don't get confused now, I've gone back because this is now a policy experiment to what the government of India reports, which is the number of boys per 100 girls. So this is the blue line is the benchmark. When you put in this conditional cash transfer program, the number of boys to girls for the bottom 2 wealth classes does drop quite a lot. But that's what you would expect. But guess what happens to the higher wealth classes? They actually get worse. And why is that the case? And that's, I think, the power of our model, because remember here in our model, the dowries are adjusting endogenously. So when you suddenly have more girls over here at the bottom, they're going to put an upward pressure on the dowry. And that's going to affect the entire wealth distribution. And as a result of that, all the girls at the top are going to get affected, or the girls' parents are going to realize that things are now getting more affected by this higher dowry, and as a result, there's going to be more sex selection. So if you look at the overall effect, in fact, you just did the math, you'd find that the net effect of this is actually negative. So a very well-intentioned program is actually going to end up worsening the sex selection on average. Now, if you had the other model where the sex selection was just given as a preference, you would not have this additional effect. You would have an improvement over here, and then this on the top, nothing would change. But what you can see here, that when you model it in this way, you can see that there is this sort of what they call a general equilibrium effect through the marriage price, which affects the entire wealth distribution. Now, what you could do instead is to just give it to all girls, not just the poor girls. You don't get much of an effect at all. I mean, it's positive, but it's not doing very much at all. The much better, the more effective strategy is to give the same amount of money directly to the girls. It's her parents who are making the decision, obviously, about sex selection, but they're altruistic. And they realize that once you give the money directly to the girl, there's no seepage. And as a result, they are way better off now. And as a result, you have much, much less sex selection. So one sort of takeaway from this is that you have to be very careful with these kinds of programs. Very well-intentioned programs like this can actually worsen the problem. The other thing you want to take away from this is that if you could somehow target the girls directly, give the money directly to married women, you would do much better, you'd be much better off than giving the money to their parents when they were children. And then the last question, which gets back to the point you were making about the changes in the seepage over time, is there anything that we can do that would directly sort of address the root cause of the problem? The root cause of the problem is 2 things: the social norm that all girls must marry, and the seepage where the girl essentially is getting just a fraction of the transfer that the husband receives. And why is that? It's because she has less bargaining power within the household. Now, one way to deal with both of these problems would be to actually increase female labor force participation. Now, this is something which I don't know whether you're familiar with this, but female labor force participation in India is abysmally low. It's about 40%. And if anything, it's been getting worse over time. In our study area, more educated women are less likely to work. Female education levels are actually right now in our study area very high. If you look at higher secondary school enrollment, it's the same for girls as it is for boys. But it doesn't make a difference because at the end of the day, they don't enter the labor force. If they don't enter the labor force, they are not independent. If they did enter the labor force, then this social norm would no longer be relevant because a girl could be single, but she would be economically independent and she would be fine. If she did marry, she would have more bargaining power because she was working. So for all of these reasons, beyond just the standard growth, of course, there are many reasons why you want women to work. But there are now what we can see is that this is going to have an additional effect through these channels on something as basic as sex selection. So I want to conclude over here with one final slide, which is just showing you what we could have if the world was better. Yeah.
Comment and a question. I believe Bolsa Familia in Brazil does give money to women with families directly. Is that?
No, but that would be, no, that's useful to know.
My question is that that's the demand side of the story within economics framework. What the supply side of the story of the technology?
Oh, you mean
You
ultrasound?
brought in the technology and how was it advertised? You showed us the advertisement up
Yeah.
front.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't there a supply side of the story to this? Is it just that the social preferences and economic story on the demand side explains everything?
So when you say supplies,
Advertising, the technology companies that brought in this, developed this technology and
right.
marketed it.
But but if you did not have a demand, I understand what you're saying. So obviously making sex selection cheaper is going to worsen a problem that exists in the first place.
Answer to her question, something happened after 1980. Technology came in. Why are
But
you
that's not-
ignoring all that?
No, I'm not ignoring that.
Economic factor.
No, I'm not ignoring that at all. So,
Second,
yeah.
a bride brings three things: a mouth, two hands, and a womb.
Right.
You're considering one, mouth.
Yeah.
Bride as a mouth.
No, I agree.
And no womb.
Yeah.
On hands and womb, also economic factor.
And as I said, what we were trying to do here was to strip down to focus on the essential features. The womb and the hands would make the problem less severe because she would actually bring something to the table, which we don't have in our model. So in our model, as you correctly said, we've stripped it down so that we've made her essentially just a parasite. She's just consuming and not contributing in any way. If she actually contributed, then of course the situation would be different. And then, of course, you could adjust, the dowry would adjust, etc. But the point that I want to make is that at some level, the amount that she's contributing right now is still not sufficient. And the reason why it's not sufficient is because women are not working. So they can work in the house and they can bring up the children. But until they actually end up going into the labor force and earning independently, the kind of story that I'm painting for you, at some level, is going to carry through. That's the point that I want to make. Yes.
When you talk about the labor workforce, you mostly talk about women being in the formal sector. But in the rural area, you do not even have the formal sector. So isn't it contradictory?
I'm not sure, because if you look even at urban India, I don't think that labor force participation rates are going up. This is the puzzle about India. I mean, there are many puzzles about our development. This is certainly, one of them. We're just not able to somehow increase female labor force participation rates. If anything, they are going down over time with development. It's just, it's something worth considering and thinking about. It could be, this is where at some point we want to stop thinking just about the economics and think about, social norms and other things as well. I would certainly think that this is a place to do that. Don't get me wrong. I took a very economic position here because I wanted to focus on one particular aspect of sex selection, which has to do with the marriage market. And because it's a market, I thought it's fair to take a very economic position to really understand the functioning of that market. But there are a lot of norms floating around over here. We have the norm that all girls must marry. We have this low female labor force participation. We have all sorts of things floating around over here which are not economic. And I don't want to at all push this idea that it's all about the economics and not about other things, okay? Not at all. That's not my position.
Another explanation for your income distribution is, as you showed well, at the top of the income distribution, the marriage is pretty equal economically. At the bottom of the girls marry up and
Yeah.
way up.
Yeah.
It's a factor two, enormously up. So if you're really altruistic, the parents are really altruistic, it's so fabulous to have a girl if you're poor, because they're going to marry up. And in principle, the parents of the girl don't get anything out of that, but probably.
No, they do, but they are. That's precisely why they have the girls. What you're saying is exactly right. That's precisely the motivation for why you have less sex selection. This is precisely, you have exactly the right mechanism. That's exactly right, yeah.
A clarification in the question. Clarification is as to why do you say that transferring it directly to the girls might help this? Mostly because, as I see, the market of marriage in a way is also a market of, this is a market between girls' parents and boys' parents. So in a way, though giving the money directly to them sort of gives them more control, but the story of dowry is not just transferring money to the girls, but also performing your parental obligation of marrying, and hence you're paying price for sort of performing that. And would the problem of dowry be independent of girls' autonomy over the money? Second, so this was a clarification, I might have missed out something in the story. And second, a question is that what are your thoughts about, instead of labor force participation and in a way that you are proposing, sort of giving a proprietary right over husband's property to women who are working in household, sort of expanding the logic of household income rather than a personal income which gets concentrated into men who sort of work in the technical sense, but in a way as women also are labor even if they are not working in a household, they are facilitating the husband to work. And so I'm just talking in terms of an alternate policy framework as to providing a sort of right in husband's own.
Well, with response to your second question, I think that one of the key drivers in our model is in fact this idea that she doesn't end up actually consuming at the same level as her husband, that there is this sort of inequality, and if you could somehow change that, then you would certainly do better. The question, of course, is how would you, this is where, we can sit down and write down models and talk about different policies, etc. But how you actually implement these things is another matter. So how would you actually, within the household, really change the allocation of resources? This is something which is really, really incredibly challenging, right? And it's not just a matter, how would you ever stipulate that, within a marital household, the woman has some right over her husband's property, for example? I just don't see how you could do it, right? Certainly there's no role for perhaps there's a legal framework that could be used in some way to do this. But, on the ground, in practice, it's not clear how you could actually implement such a scheme, right? These are all, getting back into your first question about, how could you, if in fact the girl's parent could actually give the money directly to her, that would actually, in our model, solve the problem completely. Because the girl's parent would just say, okay, I've got y, I'll keep y divided by 2, the girl gets y divided by 2, perfect, we're all set. The problem is that how would you actually ever implement such a thing? Because even if you gave the money directly to the girl, she could do that, let us say. Somehow you change the setup. So the money goes directly, even goes into a bank account in the girl's name. How can you stop her husband? This is what, when I was working many years ago in South India on these tea plantations. And, women get all this jewelry at the time of marriage, right? But what do you think happens to that jewelry? That basically the husband drinks and he pawns the jewelry to, do whatever else he wants to do with the money, right? So even nothing ultimately is out of the control at some level within a household of other family members. And that's the nature of a family, right? How can you separate, how can you assign property rights within a family? It's just not, I don't see how you can do it actually. You can do it legally, formally, but then actually what happens in reality and practice is a completely different matter. Yeah.
So many of the reports that I have read about the women's becoming a self-employed people
Yeah.
in the villages,
Yeah.
rural area, does that have any impact?
I would think so. I would hope so. To me, this seems like the critical thing. And this is something which I never thought about earlier at all. Again, Mushfiq might know more about this from the Bangladeshi case, and I think there have been many positive aspects, right? You've got some work on this, right? With Rachel Heath on, You have this sort of, this female employment, and then there are very positive outcomes in those particular villages in terms of education of kids and stuff, right?
And marriage changes.
And marriage changes too. So this is sort of, I think, here's an example, I think, of a success story where, you have extremely high labor force participation rates and we have very positive. Something about India is it's very interesting, there are many puzzles as I keep working on this country.
The comment that you just made about the urban area, the labor participation in women is still much less and it's going down.
Yeah.
That's a scary part.
Yeah, but it's something which is really needs to be, thought about. And I said, I think that economists should be there on looking at this, but it's not going to be a story simply about markets and returns to education. This is something, clearly about norms and aspirations and something much more fundamental, which has to be taken on board.
Labor force participation that we're talking about would come into your model through the norm of women have to marry.
Yeah, because if you're working, then all of a sudden, because right now I think that's probably part of the problem, right? It's the shame of the husband, of the parents, the girl's going to stay at home with them. But you know what? If she works, she's out, she's doing her own thing, it's okay, right?
Just wanted to go by your sample. You talked about a couple of things, census data, but then you had some 55,000 people that were
5,000.
I'm sorry. And this
I
is-
wish it was 55.
So 5,000 people.
5,000 households.
How did that survey take place? Was somebody going to the home?
Yes.
Was it, so it was a personal survey interview?
It is very detailed. It includes a lot of anthropometric measures which we're using in other research. So we're actually looking, for example, this is another puzzle in India, which you all might be aware of, which is that Indians have extremely low nutritional status. We're among the least way, where our BMI is extremely low, despite many decades of economic development. And so one of the things we wanted to do was to look at height for age, BMI of the adults. So we collected a lot of anthropometric measures. But we also wanted to link that, for example, to sort of diseases like diabetes and cardiovascular disease, which is again is extremely high prevalence in the South Asian population. So that was part of the survey. So we collected lots of information about the parental inputs into the children, the amount of time that parents spent with their children on different activities, the expenditures on schooling and all sorts of stuff. There's a whole, so those things would take typically about 3 hours or so to complete. So it was a very detailed survey.
And just lastly on that,
Yeah.
so how did you get in those homes?
So we first did the census. So one of the reasons why we did the census is, you might think this is kind of a crazy thing to do, but how do you actually pick 5,000 random households, which are representative?
Right.
Unfortunately, the only way to do it right is to do a census first.
Okay.
That's pretty costly. So one of the reasons why we have this data is because we did the census first. And so now we have that data. And then from the census data, we could draw houses that were represented. So we have a sort of representative sample based on the caste composition of the area, etc. So now we can actually, when we look at the data with these 5,000 households, it's not just some, stuff. They are really representative of this population.
And were they paid a fee?
No, we don't pay fees.
No,
No, we don't.
They
Yeah.
welcomed you in. How did that happen?
And that was fine. Moshrik will tell you as well. One of the advantages of being,
Practical realities are that in urban areas it's very difficult to get
Yeah.
to the top, but in rural areas people seem much happier with that kind of thing.
so I did once upon a time, I did a survey of the diamond industry in Bombay, and you can imagine how difficult that was. So I spent 2 years literally building up connections within the industry. And then I actually used my connections to essentially break into the thing. 'Cause otherwise, they won't even talk to you for a second. So, yeah, sorry.
Hi. So, I have a lot of questions. I'm going to ask you one. I'm very curious about your interlocutors, the people you speak to. What did you actually ask them? Since this talk is called Missing Girls, did you ask them about instances of feticide? And I want you to talk a little bit more about how you distinguish conceptually between feticide as an act that is done with an awareness of a future problem, pay 5,000 now and don't have to pay 5 lakh later. And the difference between that and then the networks, the mobilization of caste networks at the moment of a girl-child's marriage. Because clearly those parents did not kill their girl children when they were born.
Sure.
So it seems to me that there is a different logic or something is going on that is different. So there are some of your interlocutors who are not killing girl infants or girl fetuses, but then they are dealing with the problems sort of later on.
But that's like the China story, right? So ex ante,
right.
I mean, so one way to think about this is that at the time, before, time of whatever conception, you got to make a decision.
Right.
And in the very simple model that I had for you, there was sort of always a benefit to switching from a girl to a boy. But what I didn't maybe give enough detail to was that what we assume is that the cost of sex selection is not the same for everyone. So there are some people who will do it and others will not. And that's where I think also the cultural norms and differences across castes and across different regions of the country really comes in. It might be a lot easier for you to do this if you happen to belong to a particular caste where this is a common practice, for example. But what we assume here, of course, we ignore all of that because we're looking within caste. But the assumption is that there is a distribution of sex selection costs. And that's the reason why there'll be some families which will do it and others will not. And so at the end, sort of in equilibrium, there's going to be boys and there will be girls. And so when the time comes to marry, then of course you will, the parents of girls and the parents of boys will match just as we show in the model. So to my mind, I don't think there's anything inconsistent about that, right? You make a decision at a particular point in time that is right for you, given the cost of sex selection, which is specific to you. And then, further down the road, given the sex of your child, you operate in the marriage market accordingly. Well, this is the thing. I mean, you could do, yes, so we did lots of, like before we did, so these are very long surveys. I've been talking about this 3 hours, right? So we literally spent, I think, so to give you a sense of how long this took, I began this project in 2007. Okay, so we don't do things slowly. And we are very careful. Even economists are careful, believe it or not. And it took us a long time to actually get the funding from the NIH to actually do this, to get permission from the Indian government to actually do this. And then we spent years. So for a very long period of time, I used to spend 3 to 4 months in this particular place. And this was the only thing that I was working on for a very, very long period of time. And when we actually did these surveys, it was literally, going through this thing month after month after month, talking to people, getting their feedback, writing out the questionnaire, sending people back into the field, going back and forth, until we actually were able to come up with an instrument that actually was working. So I like to think that we are, and if you look at the list of the people I'm working with, there are sociologists on this, there are medical doctors on this, but these are people in Vellore, the Christian Medical College, who have been working in this area for a very, very long period of time. So they know this place very, very well. They know the population. So we did not just pick a random population. We are working with Indian collaborators who know this place very well. And some of these people have become, I should also mention that one of my co-authors on this project, when I started this project, she was at what was called the Tuberculosis Research Center, because this project began as a project on TB alone. And then it sort of grew in many different ways. Then she moved from there to become the Director General of the Indian Council of Medical Research. And a few weeks ago, she was appointed as the Deputy Director General of the WHO. So I have a very famous person sitting on this paper. But we started off, at least when I started off, she was in this very ramshackled office in the middle of nowhere. And then in the last 10 years, she's kind of gone very far. So, yeah.
I'm just coming in. So, but if you started the project in 2007 and now it's 17, then you do have some longitudinal data.
No.
I mean,
I wish that was true. We didn't collect data all the time. No.
But the main question I had was, in terms of your control, did you look at migration? Because we're also talking about a period in the 90s and now when there's a lot of rural to urban migration. And if migration then plays into this sex selection, because then the seepage will then, if the boy moves away from his family and goes to a different town, then how does seepage work?
That's true. That's a good point. The question, of course, is how much migration is there in India? So, well, not in this particular paper, but I have another paper quite recently looking at rural to urban migration in India. And what we find in that paper, what we document in that paper, is that in fact permanent migration in India is extremely low. This is another puzzle of the Indian economy, is that it's exceptionally low. You have temporary migration. But temporary migration, in some sense, as Mushrik will tell you, is a very different story, because in some sense you're still connected. So the type of migration that you're worried about, where the boy essentially moves away and it's a different world and there's no seepage, etc., is not going to really be very important, at least at this point in time, as far as that research tells us. So that would be my response, but that's a very good question, by the way. So it's certainly relevant.
All these things related with the higher abortion rate because of the sex selection and everything.
But you know, I think you're right that when the cost of sex selection goes down, you're going to have more sex selection. It's true in levels, but that was not going to explain why within a caste you find this particular pattern. It is true that what you're finding here, this range from 0 to 117, maybe it would not be that much. But the point I'm trying to make here is if you look on average in this population, you don't have that much sex selection. It's only 108. The key point is that within that 108, you're seeing a lot of variation under the surface. And you would not even know that if you just had district level data.
What is the unit of analysis for which 97 or 117 has been calculated?
So that is based on, what we did is we broke up the castes into 8 wealth classes, equal sized wealth classes. And the lowest wealth class has a sex ratio of 97.
And the highest
117. It's not the highest actually. It turns out in our data, as you saw, there was a little dip. So it's in fact the next to last wealth class, which turns out in the data to have the lowest one. And that's 117.
And what is the sample size within those classes?
Well, it's very large. We have 80,000 kids, right?
Okay, so the sample size.
That's the thing. That's why we can only do it with this data, because otherwise you could not do it. Because with sex selection, in some sense, you're almost close to, just noise, right? 108, if you get below 105, you're really in the world where we're sort of, thinking there's a statistical error.
Second clarifying
Yeah.
question. You talked about wealth in some places and income in other places.
Yeah.
Including in your model. And I was
Yeah.
confused by that.
Sure.
I wasn't sure in which places are you using wealth and where are you using.
So if I use the word income in the talk, it was an error because you should.
In the chart.
Oh no, it was only with the dowry, it was a dowry where I talked about the fraction of it was 3 to 4 times the annual income. But otherwise, in terms of the model of the annual income, but in terms of the model, it's always going to be in wealth. Now that you're asking me this, I can tell you something which I didn't mention in the talk, just in the interest of time, which is that when we do the census, we don't actually collect data on the wealth of these households. What we collect is the income in the last year. So we ask them, how much did you earn from your land through the land that you owned, leased or rented, plus all of the labor income, and we combine that into an annual income. Now,
Ownership itself as wealth does not appear in the.
no, it's only the flow. It's the income flow, which is in some sense is a fraction of the total wealth stock that you have. So there's a wealth stock, and then there's an income flow that comes out of that wealth stock. So in principle, there's nothing wrong with using income as a proxy for wealth. But the problem is that when you use income, however, you're going to get transitory. You're going to get noise. It's very noisy. So what we do, and that was something which came out very coincidentally, is that I was actually working on a different project on the assimilation of South Asian immigrants from the Punjab in the UK. And I was in the British Library working on that, and I discovered that that the British colonial government had done a very detailed survey of this particular area in 1871. And in 1871, they collected the revenue per cultivated acre from each of these villages. Not all of them, but most of them. All of the ones where they had what was called the Rayatwari system. So the Jamindari villages, of course, we don't have the data, but for all the Rayatwari villages, we actually have information about the land revenue per acre that was collected by the colonial government. What it turns out is that interacted with caste dummies is a very strong predictor of your income today. It's amazing. From 1871, it predicts your income today extremely well. And so what I'm showing you actually is not the actual income, it's the predicted income based on the 1871 data. Adjusted, of course, for the size of the family. So it's per capita wealth. So in that sense, it is really a wealth measure because you're really using this historical thing to predict it, and that purges all the noise.
But capitalized from a very noisy flow measure.
So that's the point. So if you use that on its own, and this is all in the paper, you don't get very strong effects because of this measurement error. But once you predict it, then the effects become much stronger. Yeah.
So I thought the variation within caste by wealth level seems really interesting feature, and your theory matches that well. But I was thinking about alternative explanation for these, standardized facts. Maybe the female labor value is much higher for the lower wealth class because they face less stigma from participating in the labor market?
But what you have to remember here is that you have to distinguish between absolute wealth and relative wealth. So you might think that a poorer household, for example, might have a particular preference for boys versus girls because the returns to boys are different from the returns to girls depending on the wealth that you have. But as I was telling Mushfiq, we control for the household wealth in absolute. The reason is because we have multiple castes. So you can separately identify the relative wealth effect and the absolute wealth effect. And most of the kinds of stories that you will be talking about would not be about relative wealth. It would not be about your position within the caste distribution. It would just be simply about how much money do I have? Do I have 50 rupees or do I have 100 rupees? That's what matters. So we can separate out these two effects. And that's the part that I kind of skipped over, where you wanted to look at the controls, etc.
Okay, so everyone must be getting hungry, and we have a post-talk reception. So let's thank Kaivan for the talk.
Thank you very much.